want to welcome you to another week in our study of the life of Samson. We've been in the book of Judges because Samson was a judge, and so we've been doing chapters 13, 14. This week I think we're in chapter 15 of the book of Judges. And so we're studying the life of Samson. What's important about Samson, interestingly enough, is that the Bible is going to set him up as a representative of Israel in this story. So while we're seeing what God wants to tell Israel, what we see is they're doing these things wrong. And that's mirrored in the fact that Samson is getting the same things wrong. And so the way in which Samson learns his lesson is hopefully a lesson for the nation of Israel who's sitting around watching. And so they see some things going on and they respond, hey, Samson, this isn't good and this isn't good. And hopefully it would dawn on them, hey, listen, aren't we doing the same thing to God that Samson is doing? And so it's interesting in that regard. Some of the things that we see, particularly this time, are, we've talked about his temptations and where he fell short. In this regard, particularly in this passage, one of the things that comes up is Samson would like for, instead of being separate, instead of being one who's called to be different and a Nazarite and all of this, what Samson wants is to kind of fit in. The original situation is because the tribe of Judah was supposed to, when they went into the promised land, they were supposed to push everybody else out. And they didn't do that. They fell short of that and they let other people stay there with them. And so what we see now with Samson is, instead of wanting to kind of push out the Philistines, he wants to mix with them. He wants to be a part of them. He wants to intermarry. He wants to marry one of their daughters. He wants to party with them. He wants to get along with them. They're the in crowd in his mind. And for some reason, he wants to go do that, all because the Philistines during this time are ruling over the tribe of Judah, over the Israelites in that way. And they're not supposed to. And so instead of being free, instead of using his life that's holy and set apart to rise up and fight them off, he doesn't. He wants to fit in. And so the idea is, as Samson tries to fit in and it goes very, very wrong, Israel's supposed to look at that and say, okay, maybe fitting in isn't such a great thing. Where should we go from here? The other thing I would say about this week's study is going through Judges chapter 15. It's quite a bit violent. And so as we go through it, trying to put ourselves back into history 2,000 years or more is a difficult thing in and of itself. But seeing the level of violence and force that it would take, in our days, we have elections, we do all kinds of things, democracies, and those things didn't exist back then. It was power against power, force against force, might against might. And that's the epitome of what Samson was, because he was of his strength. And so as we read that, I thought, okay, Daniel, let's get through some of those parts. And then I thought, you know what, they're there for a reason. So we're just going to read it as it is. And as some of the parts maybe are parts that today in our mind we think, man, that's drastic. There have been a lot of worlds up to this point that weren't in the way that we would say civilized, that were a whole lot more drastic and a whole lot more connected to death than we are, And so that's it. I just wanted to point that out at the beginning of our time here, that there's some passages here. As I read again through this passage, it's like, oh goodness, this is crazy. It seems like an overreaction perhaps to us. And yet that's the way in a whole lot of history that things have been settled by power and might, whoever's the strongest survives. And so let's dive into the book of Judges chapter 15. We'll start reading in verse 1. It says, after some days at the time of wheat harvest, and that's important in just a minute, but everybody's happy, they're bringing in the harvest, it's a rich time of the year, and everything's gone well. Samson then went back to visit his wife with a young goat. Okay, so the young goat, maybe the equivalent of a box of chocolates. He called her a heifer last time when we were studying the chapter right before this. He got mad, remember, she betrayed him. He left. Everybody thought that he left for good. And so he goes in and he says, I'm going to go in to my wife in the chamber. He's telling her dad because he's on the outside. And her father won't allow him to go in. And her father said, listen, I really thought that you utterly hated her. So I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? So take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So the idea is, he's done harm to the Philistines in the past. Maybe that was his own anger. This time his anger he thinks is deserved because he goes in, perhaps the marriage is not consummated, whatever. He got angry and left in the middle of the festivities last time. Even, as we studied last time we finished off reading, it seems like, okay, he's done with her. He went home without her. Okay, so everybody would think maybe the wedding's not on. And wedding rituals during that time, vastly, vastly different than they are now. So he takes her a young goat, which again, maybe the equivalent of a dozen roses and a box of chocolates. Here's a young goat. Maybe it wouldn't go across today like it did, depending on who's with, I guess. But this time he's angry. They gave away his wife to someone else, and he's mad. So we pick up in verse 4. It says, so Samson went and caught 300 foxes. He took torches. He turned the foxes tail to tail and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines. He set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain as well as the olive orchard. So talk about scorched earth. And this, again, maybe we wouldn't think of that being a good idea to light a torch between the foxes. But tying them together, and then you can picture them dragging a torch behind them. And then they go out into the grain fields, which at this point, harvest time, perhaps it would have been a little bit dried out by then. At least the standing grain, the standing grain was still perhaps in the field. The stacked grain was perhaps things that they had already harvested and stacked, getting ready to go through the process of finishing that off, putting it up in the barns, for example, and then also the olive orchards and others. And so he goes completely scorched earth on them. I mean, he is taking a stand. We understand that if you go out to your garden and you get some things today, perhaps the garden is still producing, could come tomorrow. But if you go to the end of a season for a crop, and they've taken some of that crop out of the ground, you not only mess that up and burn it with fire, but you burn whatever's left. That's perhaps a year's worth of crops that you're messing up. And so he hit their economy. If you go back and reread about that era, even in things that were not in the Bible, but that particular region, thousands of years ago, they were known for their wheat. They were known for a particular kind of wheat. They were known for all of the ways that they could use that. And so, he hit them kind of hard. With doing that. He was angry because, again, one person did something to him that he didn't like. He kind of took it out on the whole nation. Well, the whole nation's going to respond in just a minute. We read in verse 6. The Philistines came and they said, well, who in the world did this? See, they didn't even know who did it. And so they were told, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. So it seems to me they're taking Samson's point of view on this. Not that Samson's wrong, but that the father of the bride was wrong. We don't know exactly all the situation, but perhaps they could have waited a week to figure something out. Anyway, the Philistines came up and they burned her and her father with fire. You say that's pretty harsh, and I think it is. But if it's something that affected their whole people for a year, perhaps even with annihilation, if they don't have anything to eat, make bread, all of these other things, harsh is the word of the day. And so Samson said to them, listen, if this is what you're going to do, I swear I'll be avenged on you. And after that I will quit. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow. And he went down and stayed at the cleft of the rock of Etam. So several things going on here. One of those is the people who find out that Samson is mad with, they just go ahead and kill them and get them out of the way. They're trying to appease Samson. It didn't appease him in the least bit. He got even more mad. And he said, listen, this is so great. So talks about hitting them and he defeats them in that way between the thigh and the hip and whatever. So a lot there's going on. There's an interesting phrase here. He says, I'll be avenged upon you and after that I'll quit. One of the things that we see from Samson is the times that he's pushed into the altercations with the Philistines, it's almost like he's being forced into it. The point of his strength is to be stronger than his opponents. And yet he doesn't want to go up against his opponents. He doesn't even want them to be his opponents. Most of the time he's forced into it by, okay, you did this to wrong me, so I'll avenge whatever. But he's always looking for that time to quit. God didn't want him necessarily to quit. God wanted them to push out the people that are in their land. And he won't do it, and they won't do it. And so he's trying to teach them, if you live with your enemy, there's going to be a situation here. And so we pick up again, he's mad. He's hiding in the cleft of the rock of Etam. It's a pretty famous place in the Bible. If you go just south on the map, just south of what would be Bethlehem, then you find this place. And it's a rocky area, and there's a cleft in a particular rock there at that time. And they say it's something that still exists. So we pick up in verse 9. It says, the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah, made a raid on Lehi, and the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? So Samson goes against all the Philistines. The Philistines don't understand. Samson hides. The Philistines go up against the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah doesn't understand. And it's all started by Samson getting mad and falling short in the last chapter the way he did. So they said, we've come to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us. So the men of Judah are like, hold on, we don't want war with you. Let us go get him. Samson's such a character. They send 3,000 men of Judah down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? He said, you're picking fights here. What then is this that you have done to us? So they're saying, why have you messed us up? Because you're picking a fight with them. And his response to that is, as they did to me, so I have done to them. It's not a true statement necessarily. It's as one of them did to me, so I did to all of them for, taking away one person's wife. And his response was to kill the livelihood for the entire community there. And so it's escalating. Everything's escalating. And you say, well, if we're kind of living with our enemy in that situation, which is the analogy of God is, you've made strange bedfellows, okay? You've yoked yourself with a group that you don't agree with and you're not going to get along. Well, surely we can just tamp that down. There won't be big problems. No, there could be big problems. And those problems are going to escalate because that's what problems do. And so we pick up in verse 12 and he says, they said to them, we've come down to bind you, that we may give you in the hands of the Philistines. And Samson says to them, well, just swear to me that you're not going to attack me yourselves. And they said, no, we're only going to bind you and give you to their hands. We'll surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes, brought him up from the rock. Now, why does he want them not to kill him instead of the Philistines? I think it's because they have the secret. They know the Nazirite vow. They know how to break that vow. The Philistines don't. So he said, okay, as long as you don't kill me, I won't die, and I'll go ahead and pretend to be bound up by you. And the next verse really is an indicator of how big the strength of Samson was compared to what they were trying to do. And it says, when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. Every time he got this great strength, the Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord. And the ropes were on his arms became as a flax caught in the fire, that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey and put it in his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. So this is the escalation of it. And the level of his strength. So it says they wrapped him up with 2 new ropes. And it said that the ropes became unison in a candle wick, and it's lit, okay? And it's starting to melt away. Okay, pull that apart. Yeah, that's how, difficult. Ooh, that's how difficult it was for him to break the ropes off from around him. And it's a measure of his strength. But then, because they're attacking him, and it's escalated, and it shouldn't have escalated, it's one person's problem that became everybody's problem. And God's trying to say, a little yeast will inflict the whole piece of bread, okay? So that was an analogy from a different story in the Bible, but it's the same thing. And so he's trying to say you got to eradicate that little bit of yeast, or else it's going to spread throughout the whole thing. That's what sin does. That's what, if you don't get rid of the things God wants you to get rid of, that's what happens. So what he does is he finds a donkey with a jawbone, and he uses that as an attack, and he kills another 1,000 people. He says, well, it's still violence. I know. Force against force. And the idea is that he's strong enough, Samson, to really inflict the harm on the Philistines that would be needed to push them out of the promised land that God had promised for them. And he won't do it. He'll do it in response to being avenged. He'll do it in response to all these other things. But he's not really willing to do that in a sense that according to the mission of God, which again is just an interesting thing. And so then Samson has this thing in verse 16. And I don't know why it's set out here in quotations, but that's the way it is in most Bibles. It's set out kind of as a separate thing, either a poem that rhymes or perhaps a verse of a song he made up. And here's his song. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, and the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. So he's bragging about how strong he is, even though it clearly said us that the Spirit of the Lord rushed into him, and that's how he had his strength. He's saying, look how strong I am. So he's missing the point all the way around. They probably also don't like the fact that he's bragging so much, okay? And so we pick up again in 17. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand. The place that was called Ramoth Lehi He was very thirsty, so he called upon God and said, "You've granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and now shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the enemy?" So he's saying, listen, God, you gave me some strength and I got this great victory, and so maybe it's yours even though I'm the strong one, right? So he's kind of going back and forth, and he's saying God is strong when he needs something from God. He's saying, well, now I'm thirsty. God said, I necessarily called you to battle in the desert. You're the one who ran out there. You ran to a place with no water. It was Samson's doing to put him in, but he's pushing it on God. Okay, God, now you got to save me. And God, of course, had saved him in the first place. In verse 19, so God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and the water came out of it, and when he drank, his spirit returned, and he was revived. Therefore, the name of the place is called En Hakkore, and it is at Lehi today. And then it says of Samson that he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So 20 years he's a judge. Why is it going ahead and doing us that when the next story is not over? Well, the next story is the one that would end to finish with him not doing 21 years. So the scriptures, in the way that they're telling us this story, have almost given us a sense that, okay, well, the next story is the last one. Because it's finishing up by saying he served 20 years at this job. Okay, why at this point not 21? And that's the next story. Of course, the next story to come is the famous story of Samson and Delilah, and we're going to have some fun with that that week. Not that it's a whole lot of fun story, but it's in the way that it goes back and forth, in the way that we've already shown by talking about the first part of his life that he should have learned those same exact lessons. Samson finds himself in a place that he found himself often, and that is he is his own shortcoming. He is his own worst enemy. Nobody is stronger than Samson except for the people that ended up causing a shortfall, because he did not play to his strength. He exposed his weaknesses. So next week we're going to probably finish this up and talk about the whole episode of Samson and Delilah. But this is an interesting passage, and it's one of Samson's anger. It's one of the way that he despised his gifts. He despised his special callings. And it took him finally to that point where he would say, okay, maybe I don't want to hang out with these people. Because last week he just wanted to throw a big wedding and a big feast and marry and commingle and all those things. And now he's finally saying, okay, well, now I don't like those people anymore. But it took him a long way to get there. So Samson, again, is a evidence of God working through people who weren't very helpful to their own selves, okay? And yet God's still faithful to complete his calling through them. So interesting story. I hope that you're doing well. We look forward again to a meeting back for next week where we wrap up the story of Samson. And until then, I hope you're doing well, and I look forward to seeing you soon. God bless you.